On a crisp autumn morning in 1852, the grand bells of Boston's Trinity Church tolled for what was meant to be a union of love. But before the congregation could finish their hymns, the young bride, radiant in her white gown, collapsed at the altar, foam gathering at her lips. Her final whispered words chilled every guest who leaned in to hear them. "The wine. It burns." Within minutes, what should have been the city's most celebrated wedding turned into one of its darkest scandals, a poisoning carried out in full view of God and society. This is the story of a powerful Boston matron, her obsession with family reputation, and the lengths she would go to stop her son from marrying an Irish immigrant seamstress. It is a tale of prejudice, social ambition, and a mother-in-law's deadly revenge, remembered today as the Poisoned Chalice. Before we unravel this tragic story from Boston's past, take a moment to subscribe to the Macabre Record, and tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? On the crisp morning of October the 14th, 1852, Boston's Trinity Church was heavy with incense and expectation. The pews were filled with nearly 100 guests, a mixture of the city's Protestant elite and curious onlookers who wanted to see whether love could truly bridge the gulf between old Boston respectability and the Irish newcomers who were reshaping the city. The air was charged with anticipation, the organ notes echoing against stone walls as sunlight filtered through stained glass. At the altar, William Peaton stood tall, his nervous hands clasped before him, his eyes fixed on the doors at the far end of the nave. When the music swelled and the bride appeared, a hush fell across the congregation. Bridget O'Sullivan, only 19, seemed to float forward in her handmade white gown, her auburn hair arranged with delicate care, her face glowing with both pride and nervous joy. Her father walked beside her, his broad shoulders stiff with dignity, as if he were carrying the weight of an entire community's hope. When Bridget reached the altar, William took her hands, and the ceremony began with the solemn rhythm of Episcopal tradition. Vows were exchanged in steady voices, the groom's low baritone mixing with the bride's softer Irish lilt. Rings were placed upon trembling fingers, and the congregation leaned in as the priest prepared the final blessing, the sharing of the ceremonial wine from a polished silver chalice. Eleanor Peaton, William's widowed mother, moved gracefully to assist, her blue silk gown rustling as she arranged the vessel on the altar. To the guests, it was a simple act of a mother honoring her son's union. But when Bridget raised the cup to her lips and drank deeply, something unseen and far more sinister was set in motion. Moments later, as the final hymn rose in jubilant harmony, the bride's smile faltered. A strange expression flickered across her face. She staggered, clutching at her throat, her eyes wide with panic. The congregation gasped as she collapsed against William, her white gown spreading across the altar steps like a fallen blossom. Foam began to gather at her lips, her body convulsing in terrifying spasms. The priest shouted for assistance, and William's desperate cries filled the church, but amid the chaos, the bride managed one final whisper that several in the front pews would later swear they heard clearly. "The wine," she gasped. "It burns." With those words, the joyous wedding dissolved into horror, and Boston society would soon learn that what they had witnessed was not a tragic fainting spell, but a calculated act of murder, carried out in the most sacred of places. Boston, in 1852, was a city in transition, caught between its Puritan roots and the forces of modern industry that were reshaping its streets, its neighborhoods, and its very identity. Once a compact seaport lined with wooden wharves and brick warehouses, it had become a center of shipping, commerce, and intellectual life. Railroads spread outward like veins, carrying goods and people to distant towns, while tall chimneys marked the rise of new factories along the Charles River. The city's population swelled to more than 150,000, with Irish immigrants forming the largest and most controversial part of this growth. Driven from their homeland by famine and poverty, they arrived in Boston in waves, taking up residence in crowded tenements of the North End and South Cove. They worked the hardest and dirtiest jobs, digging canals, laying rail lines, and laboring in factories for meager wages that many native-born Bostonians believed demeaned the value of honest work. To Boston's Protestant elite, these newcomers represented more than cheap labor. They were Catholic, loyal to a pope across the sea, and their swelling numbers threatened the city's carefully maintained hierarchy. Social clubs and charitable societies whispered about the Irish problem, muttering that these immigrants brought disease, crime, and disorder. Political leaders feared their influence at the ballot box, while wealthy families recoiled from the idea of intermarriage with people they saw as unrefined and superstitious. Yet despite the prejudice, Irish families carved out spaces of dignity and community. They formed parish networks, built churches, and created their own paths of survival. It was in this city of simmering tension that the Peaton family had flourished. Their name opened doors to Boston's finest drawing rooms, their wealth a product of shipping, insurance, and manufacturing accumulated over generations. They lived on Beacon Hill in a brick mansion overlooking the Common, where manicured gardens and polished carriages were as much symbols of power as the fortunes that paid for them. To many, the Peatons embodied old Boston respectability, stable, Protestant, and immovable. At the head of this household was Eleanor Peaton, a woman who had risen through marriage from modest origins to a position of commanding influence. Widowed for more than a decade, she carried herself with an air of dignity so practiced that few dared challenge her authority. In her eyes, the Peaton name was not simply a matter of pride, but a legacy to be guarded at all costs. For Eleanor, the growing Irish presence in Boston was not a story of survival, but a creeping threat, one that now pressed against her family's door in the form of her son's choice of bride. Eleanor Peaton had not been born into the circles she now commanded. Her father had been a respectable Boston merchant, comfortable but far from the elite world of Beacon Hill. She grew up on a quieter street in the West End, where success was measured in modest houses, church attendance, and careful thrift. From a young age, she recognized the boundaries of class and the subtle cruelty with which Boston society policed them. When she married Jonathan Peaton in 1818, she crossed those invisible lines with a mixture of charm, ambition, and what some whispered was shrewd calculation. Jonathan had been heir to a family shipping fortune, a man who valued intelligence as much as social pedigree, and Eleanor provided both beauty and the sharp mind to manage a household of prominence. Their union shocked some, but in time it became proof that Eleanor could not only adapt to Boston's highest circles but dominate them. When Jonathan died suddenly of apoplexy in the 1830s, Eleanor was left in control of a fortune large enough to sustain the family for generations. Many expected her to remarry quickly, as widows of means often did, but Eleanor chose differently. She assumed sole command of the estate, managing investments in shipping, textiles, and insurance with a steady hand. In drawing rooms and at society gatherings, she became known as a woman of formidable presence, gracious in public yet uncompromising when it came to the Peaton legacy. Her sense of identity fused completely with the family name. To speak of Eleanor was to speak of Peaton respectability, Peaton wealth, and Peaton influence. That sense of control extended inward, especially to her only child, William. Eleanor had carried William with difficulty, after years of miscarriages that had nearly broken her spirit. When he was born, she believed him touched by Providence, a miracle entrusted to her care. From his earliest days, she guarded him fiercely, surrounding him with tutors, books, and the expectations of greatness. She charted every step of his education, ensuring he attended the best schools and later the halls of Harvard, where he studied law and literature. She scrutinized his friendships, corrected his manner of speech, and reminded him at every turn of the honor and burden of his family name. To outsiders, it appeared a devoted mother shaping a brilliant young man for success. To those who knew Eleanor better, it was clear she saw William not as an independent soul, but as the vessel through which her ambition and the Peaton legacy would continue. That devotion, once born of love and loss, would harden into something darker, a belief that she alone could decide the shape of his life, even at the cost of others. William Peaton grew into the kind of young man who seemed destined to fulfill every hope his mother had laced upon him. Tall, with the dark hair of his late father and the clear grey eyes of Eleanor, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that set him apart from his peers. At Harvard, he distinguished himself not only through academic achievement, but also through an easy eloquence that made him a natural in debates and public discussions. His professors described him as thoughtful, reserved, yet capable of passion when speaking about matters of justice, literature, or philosophy. Upon graduation, he returned to Boston with the expectation that he would soon take up a role in the family's business interests, lending his talents to the management of their shipping and insurance enterprises. To Boston society, William was the picture of an eligible bachelor, handsome, educated, and heir to a respected name. In the drawing rooms of Beacon Hill, whispers followed him. Mothers with daughters of marriageable age noted his quiet dignity and his courtly manners. He attended dances and society gatherings with a polite presence, but rarely lingered in conversation with any particular young woman. Some interpreted this restraint as shyness. Others suspected it was the influence of Eleanor, who remained ever watchful of his prospects. Suitors were gently presented to him, daughters of lawyers, judges, and wealthy merchants, but William entertained them only with the formality expected of him. His heart, it seemed, lay elsewhere. Despite his position, William was not a man who sought luxury or constant celebration. He preferred evenings with books, long walks along the Charles, or discussions at Boston's Athenaeum, where lectures on literature and philosophy drew both scholars and curious citizens. Friends sometimes joked that he had the soul of a poet trapped in the duties of a businessman. For William, the weight of his family name was both a gift and a burden. He admired his mother's strength, and he understood the importance of reputation, but there was also a longing within him to shape his own path, to find companionship not defined by society's rigid expectations, but by genuine affection. It was this quiet defiance of unspoken rules that would lead him across the invisible boundary, dividing Boston's Protestant elite from its Irish newcomers. In a city where every accent and every surname could be measured as a sign of belonging or exclusion, William would find himself drawn not to the daughters of Beacon Hill, but to a young woman who represented everything his mother feared most, an Irish Catholic seamstress with little more than her intelligence and dignity to her name. The O'Sullivan family arrived in Boston during the late 1840s, part of the desperate tide of Irish migration spurred by famine and despair. Patrick O'Sullivan, a widower in his late 30s, carried with him not only his children, but also the resilience of a man who had watched his homeland starve and yet refused to surrender to hopelessness. In Boston, he found work at a metalworks near the waterfront, where his knowledge of machinery from Dublin's textile mills proved valuable. The pay was modest, but it was steady, enough to move his family into a small but respectable house on the edge of the South End, away from the most crowded tenements of the North End. Though they lived without luxury, Patrick took pride in maintaining a clean, orderly home, determined that his children would not be swallowed by the poverty that trapped so many of their fellow immigrants. His eldest daughter, Bridget, was 17 when they settled in Boston. She stood out immediately, not only for her auburn hair and striking green eyes, but for a poise that seemed uncommon among the weary arrivals who flooded the docks. She carried herself with a quiet grace that suggested an inner strength beyond her years. Bridget soon found work as a seamstress at one of the more fashionable dress shops on Tremont Street, where her delicate stitching and her ability to converse politely with Boston's ladies made her valuable to her employer. Unlike many Irish immigrants, whose thick accents marked them as outsiders, Bridget spoke with a softened lilt, her words careful and clear, which only added to her appeal in a city that often judged people by their speech. Bridget's days were long, hours bent over fabric, pricking her fingers as she worked lace and silk into the designs demanded by her wealthier customers. But she never complained. She read voraciously in her spare time, borrowing books from sympathetic patrons and parish priests. Shakespeare, Byron, and American poets filled her evenings, their words forming a world of imagination and ideas far removed from the needle and thread that defined her daily life. Her education was not formal, but it was deep, and her intelligence shone in every conversation she held. To her younger siblings, she was both a mother figure and a model of strength. To her father, she was proof that his sacrifices in leaving Ireland had not been in vain. In a city that often dismissed Irish girls as little more than servants or factory hands, Bridget O'Sullivan carried herself with a dignity that drew attention wherever she went. It was this quiet radiance that would soon catch the eye of William Peaton, a man whose world could not have been more different from her own, yet who would find in her the very qualities he had long sought, but never found among Boston's elite. It was at the Boston Athenaeum, during one of the city's public lectures, that William Peaton and Bridget O'Sullivan first crossed paths. The lecture hall was filled with scholars, students, and curious citizens eager to hear a visiting professor from Harvard speak on the subject of American literature and its European influences. For most in attendance, it was an evening of polite listening and casual intellectual display. But for Bridget, it was an opportunity. Encouraged by her employer, who believed education and refinement would make her seamstresses more valuable, she had begun attending such talks whenever she could. Though seated toward the back in the section reserved for working people, she listened intently, her mind alight with ideas. When the floor was opened for questions, she rose, her voice carrying through the hall, as she asked about the influence of Irish poetry on the works of American writers. Her words were thoughtful, precise, and spoken without hesitation. A ripple passed through the audience, surprised that an Irish girl plainly dressed could pose such an elegant and intelligent question. Among those listening was William Peaton, seated nearer the front with other young men of Boston's intellectual circles. He turned, his eyes finding the source of the voice, and was immediately struck not just by Bridget's beauty, but by the clarity of her thought. When the lecture ended, as the audience filed out into the gaslit streets, William Leseniers, injured. He approached her as she gathered her cloak, removing his hat in the polite gesture of a gentleman. "That was an excellent question about Irish influence," he said with measured warmth. "I'm William Peaton. I don't believe we've been introduced." Bridget's cheeks coloured slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Bridget O'Sullivan, Mr. Peaton. I'm pleased to make your acquaintance." What might have ended as a brief exchange stretched into a walk along Tremont Street, their conversation flowing with unexpected ease. William asked about her reading, and Bridget spoke of the books she had borrowed, the poetry she loved, and the way words seemed to open doors to a world far larger than the one she inhabited. William, accustomed to shallow chatter at society gatherings, found her sincerity and insight disarming. Bridget, though cautious, sensed in him a kindness and seriousness that set him apart from other young men of privilege. When they parted at a street corner, William hesitated before asking if she would attend the next lecture. Bridget's smile softened her features as she replied, "I would enjoy that very much." With that, the first threads of their unlikely courtship were woven, threads that would soon pull two worlds together and drive another woman to despair. The weeks that followed their first meeting unfolded with a quiet intensity that neither William nor Bridget had anticipated. What began with shared attendance at lectures soon grew into walks along the Charles River, where the autumn leaves painted the city in gold and crimson. They spoke of books, of history, of faith, and of the future each imagined for themselves. For Bridget, it was a revelation to converse so freely with a man of William's standing, one who listened without condescension and who seemed to value her thoughts as much as her company. For William, it was the discovery of a companionship unlike anything he had known among the young women of Boston's drawing rooms, where talk was often limited to gossip or trivialities. Bridget's sincerity, her hunger for knowledge, and her calm strength stirred something in him that had long lain dormant. They were cautious at first, mindful of the eyes of a city where class lines were sharply drawn. William escorted her to concerts and public lectures, occasions respectable enough to shield their meetings from suspicion, but in quieter moments they found chances to linger longer together. On Sundays, Bridget would sometimes walk with him through the public garden after Mass, her rosary tucked discreetly into her pocket, while William marvelled at how natural it felt to be at her side. When they parted, there was always the sense of unfinished conversation, of something more that awaited them just beyond the next meeting. Inevitably, whispers began. A seamstress, seen often in the company of a man of William's stature, could not escape notice for long. Some of Bridget's fellow workers remarked on it with envy, others with warning, reminding her that Boston's elite did not easily forgive what they perceived as overreaching ambition. Bridget listened but kept her counsel. She had no illusions about the obstacles between twos. Yet the sincerity of William's affection made her hope that their bond was not as fragile as society might assume. For William, the more time he spent with Bridget, the more resolute he became. He admired her resilience, her dignity, and the courage with which she bore the burdens of her family's immigrant status. He began to see clearly what he wanted in a partner: intelligence, warmth, and a sense of purpose, not simply a pedigree. But William also knew the greatest test lay ahead. His mother, Eleanor, remained unaware of the relationship, and when the truth came to light, her response would determine whether their fragile happiness could survive. For nearly half a year, Eleanor remained blissfully ignorant of her son's secret romance. William had grown adept at keeping his private life shielded from her ever-watchful eyes, and she, accustomed to his discretion, assumed his frequent absences were owed to business or harmless social obligations. But secrecy is a fragile thing, and one summer afternoon in 1851, it fractured. Eleanor had decided to surprise her son at his office on Tremont Street, carrying with her a basket of refreshments and news of an invitation to a governor's reception. Climbing the narrow stairwell, she heard the murmur of voices, William's familiar tone and, more disturbingly, a woman's voice she did not recognize. She paused at the landing, her hand tightening around the basket's handle until her knuckles went white. Through the door came words that struck her like a physical blow. "My mother will never accept this," William was saying, his voice steady yet strained. "But I don't care anymore, Bridget. I love you, and that is what matters." Eleanor's breath caught, and for a moment she thought her heart might stop. The reply, gentle and tinged with the faint lilt of Ireland, made her blood run cold. "I don't want to come between you and your family. She sacrificed so much for you, William. She deserves your loyalty." Eleanor pressed herself against the wall, listening as her son's voice deepened with defiance. "She has controlled every choice of my life since Father died, whom I should see, what path I should take. But I am a man now, Bridget, and my decision is made. Soon I will tell her, and she will have no choice but to see you as I do." The scrape of a chair across the floor sent Eleanor fleeing down the stairs in a storm of panic. By the time she reached her carriage, her shock had curdled into a rage so sharp it left her trembling. An Irish girl, an immigrant seamstress of all things. Her William, the pride of the Peaton name, was planning to tie himself to a Catholic family of meagre means. Everything Eleanor had laboured to build, every careful step she had taken into Boston's upper circles, would be undone by this single choice. She returned to Beacon Hill in a daze, her mind already circling with dark thoughts. At dinner that evening, she watched William carve the roast with an unusual lightness in his expression, humming softly under his breath. He was happier than she had seen him in years, and Eleanor understood in that moment that her battle was no longer against idle rumour or distant threats. It was against her own son's will, and the Irish girl who had captured it. The truth could not remain hidden for long. Eleanor, unwilling to wait for William's confession, steeled herself to confront him directly. One morning, as he lingered over coffee and the morning paper in their Beacon Hill dining room, she set aside her pretense of polite conversation. Her voice was calm, measured, but beneath it throbbed the sharp edge of control. "William, I hear whispers. Whispers of a young woman you've been keeping company with. An Irish girl, if the talk is to be believed." He folded the paper slowly, his grey eyes meeting hers with a rare flicker of defiance. "Her name is Bridget O'Sullivan, mother. And she is not merely someone I keep company with. She is the woman I intend to marry." The words hung in the air like a bell toll. Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the porcelain cup before her, but she did not let her composure crack. "Marry her?" she repeated, her tone laden with incredulity. "William, you cannot be serious. Think of what you are proposing. The Peaton name bound to an immigrant seamstress, a Catholic no less. Do you have any idea what this would mean for our family?" William's jaw tightened as he leaned forward. "I know precisely what it means. It means choosing a life with a woman of intelligence, kindness, and dignity, rather than shackling myself to empty expectations. I love her, mother, and I will not cast her aside to satisfy the prejudices of society, or your own." Eleanor's mask slipped. "Prejudices? You speak as if centuries of difference can be swept away by youthful infatuation. Marriage is more than love. It is heritage, alliance, reputation. Do you truly believe that the best families of Boston will welcome her? That your children will find acceptance when their mother comes from the tenements?" Her son rose from the table, his voice cold. "I had hoped for your blessing, but I see now it was a fool's hope. I love Bridget, and nothing you say will change that. Tonight, I will ask her father for her hand, and soon she will be my wife." The sharpness of his words cut through Eleanor's heart like a knife. She sat in silence as he left the room, the echo of his footsteps fading up the staircase. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of defeat pressing down on her shoulders. But beneath her humiliation burned a fiercer determination. If William would not listen to reason, then she would find another way. She had not clawed her way into Boston's highest ranks to watch her legacy unravel in the hands of an Irish girl. News of the engagement spread quickly, for nothing in Boston's social world remained private for long. A modest notice appeared in the Boston Evening Transcript, announcing that William Peaton, son of the late Jonathan and Mrs. Eleanor Peaton of Beacon Hill, was formally betrothed to Miss Bridget O'Sullivan, daughter of Mr. Patrick O'Sullivan of the South End. It was only a few lines, tucked within the society section, yet it struck the city like a clap of thunder. At tea tables and in gentlemen's clubs, the whispers began. Some called it an act of youthful folly, others a disgrace. To many of Boston's elite, the notion of a Peaton uniting himself with an Irish immigrant girl was unthinkable, a breach of unspoken boundaries that kept the old families separate from the flood of newcomers reshaping their city. Within days, Eleanor felt the sting of humiliation. At a Ladies' Aid Society meeting, women who had once greeted her with deference now spoke in careful tones, their congratulations edged with pity. One matron remarked that it was remarkably charitable of William to look beyond differences of class and faith, her thin smile suggesting anything but approval. Another, whose own Irish ancestry had long been conveniently forgotten, reminded the group of the importance of marriages that preserve harmony in society. The words were aimed squarely at Eleanor, who sat stiffly, her teacup rattling against its saucer, though her hand did not tremble. She forced a smile, but the acid of their judgment burned deep within her. At social gatherings, the pattern repeated. Men at the clubs offered perfunctory congratulations, but could not hide their bemusement, muttering about how quickly fortunes could be squandered on sentiment. Friends who once sought Eleanor's favour now looked upon her with something between curiosity and scorn. The Peaton name, which had carried weight and admiration for decades, was suddenly the subject of gossip and ridicule. In drawing rooms across the city, the question was repeated in hushed tones. What had possessed William Peaton to throw away his future on a girl from the immigrant quarter? For Eleanor, each whispered slight was another lash upon her pride. She bore it outwardly with dignity, but behind the walls of her mansion, she seethed. The engagement had not only endangered her family's reputation, it had already begun to unravel it. To her, it was no longer a matter of preference or even maternal concern. It was survival. The legacy she had built was crumbling before her eyes, and she resolved that she would not let it fall without a fight. In the weeks that followed the announcement, Eleanor's thoughts circled endlessly around the figure of Bridget O'Sullivan. She could not speak her name without bitterness, yet she could not escape her presence. The girl seemed to haunt her, appearing in conversations, in newspapers, and in the imagination of society. Wherever Eleanor went, it was Bridget's name she heard, sometimes with amusement, sometimes with admiration, but always in ways that left her feeling diminished. Determined not to remain ignorant of the enemy that threatened her family's standing, she began to study Bridget as carefully as she might study a rival general across a battlefield. She attended public events where she knew the couple would appear, watching from a distance as Bridget navigated the unfamiliar terrain of Boston's upper circles. To Eleanor's mounting frustration, the girl did not stumble. She carried herself with a natural grace that softened even the sharpest eyes in the room. When spoken to, she answered with humility and intelligence. Her Irish accent softened into something almost musical. The very qualities Eleanor had hoped would expose Bridget as unsuitable instead seemed to elevate her in the eyes of others. Friends who might once have sneered in private admitted that she was a remarkable young woman, dignified beyond her station. This realization did not temper Eleanor's opposition. It deepened it. Bridget's poise, her elegance, her ability to win sympathy, all of it threatened to erode the barrier Eleanor believed must remain between families like the Petons and the immigrant newcomers. Even worse was William's devotion, plain for all to see. He hovered near Bridget with a protectiveness Eleanor had not imagined in her son, a tenderness that left no doubt of his feelings. He matched his stride to hers, listened with rapt attention to her every word, and defended her against the small cruelties of whispered remarks. To Eleanor, this devotion was intolerable, for it meant that William would never abandon Bridget willingly. In the quiet of her mansion, Eleanor's mind replayed every humiliation she had suffered since the engagement, every sympathetic smile that had masked ridicule, every glance that told her she was no longer the unassailable matron of Boston society. She convinced herself that Bridget was not merely unsuitable but dangerous, a cunning interloper who had ensnared William with charm and intelligence. Night after night, Eleanor paced the floor of her sitting room, her resentment hardening into obsession. It was no longer enough to oppose the marriage. She began to think of ways to stop it entirely, by any means necessary. Eleanor's first instinct was to employ the weapons that had served her well in the past: persuasion, influence, and strategy. She considered every angle with the precision of a chess player plotting moves in advance. If William would not be swayed by argument, perhaps others could be enlisted to pressure him. She contemplated approaching Patrick O'Sullivan, imagining that the Irishman might be persuaded to withdraw his consent. Money, after all, had a way of solving problems, and she believed a man of his class would find the prospect of a generous settlement impossible to resist. Yet even as she planned the conversation, doubts crept in. Patrick was known as a man of stern principle, proud of his hard-won respectability. If he rejected her offer and chose to reveal it, the scandal would be hers alone. The thought of being exposed as a scheming matron who tried to buy off a bride's father was intolerable. Another tactic came to her in the quiet of an evening: feigning illness. If she were to fall gravely unwell, William's sense of duty might compel him to postpone the wedding indefinitely. She rehearsed in her mind how she might present herself as weak, her voice trembling with carefully staged frailty. But William had grown sharper in recent months, less trusting of appearances. If he suspected her illness was contrived, it would drive him further into Bridget's arms. And even if he believed her, time was no longer her ally. Postponement was not prevention. She turned at last to the most severe of threats: disinheritance. The thought of severing her son from the family fortune horrified her almost as much as the marriage itself, yet she weighed it carefully. Without money, William would be forced to abandon the marriage or live in disgrace, stripped of the wealth and influence that defined him. But this, too, was fraught with peril. To disinherit her only child was to relinquish the very control she had fought to maintain. Worse, she knew William well enough to realize he might marry Bridget regardless, choosing love even in poverty. Then the Peaton fortune, carefully preserved through years of careful management, would eventually pass out of her grasp entirely. Each option revealed itself as a trap, a path more dangerous than the last. By late autumn, Eleanor found herself cornered. She could neither dissuade her son by gentle appeal nor drive him away with threats. Every traditional weapon of influence had failed her, and the date of the wedding crept ever closer. In the dark hours of sleepless nights, she began to contemplate measures she had once dismissed as unthinkable. If society's rules could not protect the Peaton name, then perhaps something far more decisive could. It was during one of these restless nights, seated in her late husband's study with a candle guttering low, that Eleanor stumbled upon the possibility that would change everything. She had taken to combing through Jonathan's old correspondence and business papers, searching for some overlooked document that might grant her legal control over William's inheritance, even after his marriage. What she found instead was a series of letters exchanged with a merchant in New York who specialized in industrial chemicals. Jonathan, ever curious about new methods of manufacturing, had once considered an investment in textile treatments that promised to preserve fabric against wear. In the margin of one letter, a certain compound was mentioned in meticulous detail: arsenic oxide. The merchant described it as a white crystalline powder, easily dissolved in liquid, almost tasteless, and capable of causing violent illness or sudden death if mishandled. Though Jonathan had abandoned the idea as too dangerous, he had kept the correspondence, perhaps as a curiosity or a warning. Eleanor read the passages again and again, her heart thudding with a rhythm that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. The words presented themselves not as abstract science but as opportunity. Arsenic was not unknown in polite society. Housewives sometimes whispered about it in the context of rat poison. Physicians cautioned against accidental exposure, but its true properties remained hidden from most. Here, in these letters, lay a weapon that could strike swiftly and invisibly. A wedding, with its ceremonial chalice of wine, offered the perfect stage. To most eyes, it would appear as if a fragile bride had collapsed under the weight of excitement. To Eleanor, it would be the salvation of her family's honor. The days that followed were filled with grim deliberation. She weighed the risks, imagining how quickly suspicion might turn toward her if her actions were clumsy. But the more she considered it, the clearer it became. Every other avenue had failed her, and this was the only path left. Using Jonathan's old letters as credentials, she arranged a discreet trip to New York under the pretense of settling his unfinished affairs. At the office of Hartwell Chemical Supply, she spoke knowledgeably of industrial uses and requested a small sample for experimental purposes. The merchant, respectful of Jonathan's memory, offered her a vial wrapped in cloth, cautioning her to handle it with great care. She accepted it with serene composure, though inside she trembled at the enormity of what she carried. On the train back to Boston, the vial rested in her reticule, its presence a silent promise. Eleanor did not yet know exactly how she would use it, but she knew with certainty that she would. The Irish girl would not become her daughter-in-law. Once the vial of arsenic was safely hidden in a locked drawer of her writing desk, Eleanor devoted herself to planning with the précise ion of a general preparing for battle. Every hour not spent in public performance of her social duties was consumed by rehearsals in secrecy. She studied Jonathan's letters again, noting the measurements and descriptions, and compared them against medical texts borrowed discreetly from the Boston Athenaeum. She read of symptoms, burning throat, convulsions, rapid decline, until the knowledge etched itself into her mind like scripture. Carefully she measured small amounts of the powder with a silver spoon, watching how quickly it dissolved in water and wine. She was struck by its invisibility, its treacherous subtlety. A half-teaspoon, she determined, would be sufficient to bring about death within an hour, yet appear outwardly like sudden illness or a weak heart overcome by excitement. Her plan took shape with chilling clarity. The poison would be slipped into the ceremonial chalice at the wedding itself, when attention was fixed on the solemn ritual and no one's eyes lingered on the mother of the groom. Eleanor, ever poised, would offer her assistance in preparing the wine as a gesture of honor, her movements graceful and unrevealing. With the sachet hidden in her dress, she could release its contents into the chalice in the time it took to adjust the table or lift a spoon. The red wine would conceal the powder entirely, and the joy of the moment would blind even the most suspicious eye to what she had done. Again and again she rehearsed the action in the privacy of her chamber. She practiced the motion of removing the sachet, loosening its silk tie, and tipping the white grains into a cup as though she were only smoothing the folds of her gown. She timed herself, ensuring that the act could be completed in less than a breath, and she repeated it until her fingers moved with the precision of instinct. In her mirror, she watched her face as she practiced composure. No twitch, no flicker of the eyes must betray her purpose. Only calm dignity, the bearing of a mother who desired nothing more than to see her son happily wed. At times she felt a flicker of unease, a whisper of conscience warning her of the abyss she was approaching. But she smothered it with resolve, convincing herself that this was not murder but preservation. Bridget's death would be tragic, yes, but it would restore order, protect William, and save the Peaton name from disgrace. In Eleanor's mind, the act was not villainy, but sacrifice, a necessary cruelty to shield the legacy she had built. By the eve of the wedding, every detail of her plan was engraved upon her heart, leaving no space for hesitation. The morning of October the 14th, 1852, broke clear and cold, the kind of autumn day that made Boston's air feel sharp with promise. From the windows of her Beacon Hill mansion, Eleanor watched the city stir to life, carriages rattling across cobblestones, vendors calling out on street corners, church bells striking the hour. She had not slept more than a few hours, yet she rose with a clarity of purpose that steadied her nerves. Today would decide everything. If her plan unfolded as rehearsed, by nightfall her son would be free of the Irish girl, the scandal extinguished before it had time to root itself deeper. She dressed with exquisite care, choosing a gown of deep blue silk trimmed with lace, and around her neck she clasped the pearl necklace Jonathan had given her on their wedding day. To all who saw her, she would appear a dignified matron, prepared to witness her son's joy. To herself, she was an executioner cloaked in silk. The vial, emptied the night before into a sachet of fine fabric, rested in the inner pocket of her gown. She had measured the amount with the same precision she had practiced countless times. Just enough to ensure death, not enough to arouse immediate suspicion. She touched the hidden weight now and then as she moved about the house, a reminder that the outcome of the day was literally in her hands. When the carriage arrived to take her to Trinity Church, she stepped inside without hesitation, her gloved fingers tightening briefly on the reticule in her lap. Meanwhile, the city buzzed with anticipation. Invitations had been limited, but word of the wedding had spread, and the notion of a union between a Peaton and an O'Sullivan drew spectators to linger near the churchyard, craning to see the arriving guests. Patrick O'Sullivan and his younger children came dressed in their best clothes, their pride visible in every step. Friends of the family, both Irish and American, whispered about the miracle of such a match. Within Boston's upper circle, however, the atmosphere was more complicated. The matrons and merchants who stepped from polished carriages carried expressions carefully arranged between politeness and curiosity, each eager to witness what many considered a scandal disguised as a sacrament. By the time the bells began to toll, the pews of Trinity were nearly full, a mingling of worlds that rarely met except in uneasy commerce. Eleanor took her place near the front, every inch of her posture composed. Around her neck, the pearls glimmered faintly in the shifting light, but her mind was fixed only on the chalice that would soon hold more than wine. The great doors of Trinity Church opened to the sound of the organ, and a hush fell over the congregation as Bridget O'Sullivan appeared at the rear of the nave. She seemed almost ethereal in her white gown, simple yet elegant, the handiwork of her own skilled fingers. A crown of orange blossoms rested lightly in her auburn hair, and her cheeks glowed with the flush of youth. On her father's arm, she moved with quiet dignity down the aisle, her eyes fixed on William, who waited at the altar with an expression of unguarded devotion. Guests turned their heads, some smiling despite themselves, others whispering behind gloved hands. Even those who had spoken harshly of the match could not deny the bride's striking presence. The ceremony began with solemn reverence. Father Matthews, his voice deep and measured, intoned the ancient words of the episcopal rite. Vows were exchanged, rings slipped onto trembling fingers, and the murmurs of approval rippled softly through the pews. William's voice did not falter, and Bridget's, though delicate, carried a strength that seemed to silence every doubt. For a fleeting moment, even Eleanor felt the weight of the sacredness around her, as though the stone walls themselves were bearing witness. But her resolve did not waver. She knew the final act still awaited her. As the priest moved to prepare the blessing of the wine, Eleanor rose gracefully from her pew. She approached the altar with measured steps, her silken skirts whispering against the stone floor. "Allow me to assist, Arthur," she said with practiced warmth, her hand resting lightly on the polished silver chalice she had gifted for the occasion. He nodded with gratitude, turning briefly to address the congregation on the meaning of the sacrament. In that instant, Eleanor's fingers slipped into her gown, found the sachet, and tipped its contents into the deep red wine. With the ease of countless rehearsals, she stirred it with a silver spoon, the grains dissolving invisibly, leaving the liquid unaltered in taste or appearance. Her hand moved steadily, her expression calm, as though she were merely smoothing the folds of her gown. When she returned to her seat, her heart thundered so violently she feared it might betray her. The priest lifted the chalice, offering it first to William, who took a ceremonial sip before passing it to his bride. Bridget accepted it with both hands, her face radiant as she drank deeply. She returned the vessel, unaware that she had just swallowed the carefully measured dose of death. Around them, the congregation watched in reverent silence, never suspecting that the most sacred moment of the ceremony had been profaned by a mother's hand. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap, her expression serene, but inside she waited, pulse quickening for the poison to take its course. When the final hymn ended and the newlyweds turned to face the congregation, the church erupted in applause. Smiles spread across the pews, and a stream of guests pressed forward to offer their congratulations. Eleanor stood among them, her face arranged into a mask of maternal pride, though her eyes never left Bridget. She watched for the slightest falter in her step, the faintest pallor in her cheeks, any sign that the invisible powder was beginning its grim work. At first, there was nothing. Bridget laughed softly at William's whispered words, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She greeted friends, curtsied politely to acquaintances, and carried herself with all the glow of a woman newly married. To Eleanor, each untroubled breath was a needle of doubt, pricking the certainty she had built so carefully. By the time the procession reached the Piton home for the wedding breakfast, nearly half an hour had passed, and still Bridget seemed untouched. Eleanor's pulse quickened with unease. Could the dosage have been too small? Had she miscalculated, or had the merchant given her a substance less potent than promised? The thought of failure gnawed at her as she greeted guests at the door, the fine silk of her gown concealing the storm of panic within. The reception unfolded with elegance befitting a family of the Piton's stature. Tables gleamed with silver and china, laden with oysters, roasted meats, pastries and champagne. The air filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses as Boston's elite mingled uneasily with Irish relatives and friends. Bridget, radiant in her gown, accepted well wishes with grace, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright. To many, she seemed proof that the social divide could indeed be bridged by love. To Eleanor, she seemed an apparition of defiance, stubbornly refusing to collapse as planned. Then, just as Eleanor began to despair, it happened to D. Bridget paused mid-sentence while speaking with one of William's cousins, her hand pressing suddenly to her stomach. Her smile faltered, and a faint shadow of pallor crossed her face. William, noticing immediately, moved to her side. She whispered something to him, too low for Eleanor to catch, and he guided her to a nearby chair. Within moments, the change was undeniable. Bridget's breathing grew shallow. Her hands trembled, and beads of perspiration dotted her brow despite the cool October air. A murmur spread through the room as guests exchanged anxious glances. The young bride's lips parted, and with a voice hoarse and strained she murmured, "The wine. It burns." Gasps echoed through the reception hall. William knelt beside her, frantic, calling for assistance. Eleanor, standing only steps away, pressed her gloved hands together in a perfect imitation of maternal concern. Inside, however, she felt the first flicker of triumph. The chalice had done its work. The room fell into disarray as Bridget's condition worsened. Guests who only moments before had been raising glasses now stood frozen, their faces pale with alarm. William clutched his bride's hand, his voice breaking as he called her name, begging her to stay awake. Into this chaos stepped Dr. Harrison, a physician of long standing in Boston society who happened to be among the wedding guests. A man of measured tone and steady hands, he pushed through the crowd, kneeling at Bridget's side with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to emergencies. He asked for water, examined her pulse, and studied her complexion. "What are your symptoms, child?" he asked gently. Bridget's lips trembled as she forced out the words, "My throat. Burning. My stomach." She broke off with a groan, her body shaking with convulsions that drew gasps from the surrounding guests. Dr. Harrison's expression grew grave. "This is no fainting spell," he murmured. He directed servants to fetch salt water immediately and ordered someone to run to his office for his medical bag. The guests obeyed in a flurry, grateful for instructions that gave shape to their panic. Eleanor stood close by, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes fixed on Bridget. She murmured, "Poor girl. The excitement must have been too much," her tone perfectly balanced between sympathy and poise. But when Bridget, gasping for air, whispered again about the wine, Eleanor felt her blood turn to ice. Dr. Harrison, however, heard it clearly. His eyes flicked up sharply, first to William, then to Eleanor, before returning to his patient. "The wine, you say?" he pressed. Bridget could only nod weakly, her eyes fluttering shut for a moment before William shook her gently, desperate to keep her awake. The physician rose and addressed the room. "Someone must return to Trinity Church at once. Bring the chalice used in the ceremony and the bottle of wine from which it was poured." His voice carried such authority that no one dared question him. 2 men rushed to comply, leaving the house with grim determination. Around the room, uneasy whispers began. Only the bride and groom had drunk from that vessel, and William was perfectly healthy. What then could have afflicted Bridget alone? Eleanor felt a tightening in her chest as she realized where the physician's logic might lead. She tried to mask her fear with a veneer of composure, suggesting softly that perhaps the young bride had been weakened by nerves or by the strain of her humble constitution. But the look in Dr. Harrison's eyes was not one of reassurance. It was suspicion. For the first time, Eleanor felt the walls of her carefully constructed plan beginning to close around her. The guests who had rushed to Trinity returned within the hour, bearing the silver chalice wrapped carefully in cloth and the opened bottle from which the ceremonial wine had been poured. Dr. Harrison wasted no time. In the small study adjoining the reception hall, he conducted simple chemical tests with the precision of a man long practiced in medicine and science. Within minutes, his worst suspicions were confirmed. Holding up a strip of paper discolored by reaction, he announced grimly, "There are traces of arsenic in this chalice, and the same contamination lingers in the wine. This was no accident. Someone has deliberately poisoned the cup from which the bride drank." The words struck the assembled guests like a thunderclap. Shocked murmurs swept through the room, and several women clutched at their throats as if they too might collapse. William stared at the doctor in disbelief, his face pale with horror. "Poison?" he whispered. "Who would do such a thing? She has no enemies here." But even as he spoke, his eyes travelled slowly to his mother, who stood stiff and silent near the fireplace, her hands folded neatly, her face a mask of composure. Dr. Harrison, too, let his gaze rest upon her, not accusing yet, but probing with a look that seemed to pierce through layers of pretense. "The question," he said carefully, "is who had access to the chalice between the time it was set upon the altar and the moment it was lifted to the lips of the bride and groom?" Bridget stirred then, her voice faint but clear enough to hush the room. "The wine!" she gasped, her eyes fluttering open. William knelt immediately at her side, holding her hand, urging her to speak. Her gaze swept the room until it fixed upon Eleanor. "I saw her," she whispered, each word strained. "At the altar. She stirred something into the cup." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ragged sound of Bridget's breathing. William's face drained of colour as he turned toward his mother. "Tell me this isn't true," he said, his voice trembling. Eleanor felt the eyes of the entire gathering upon her. For years she had mastered the art of silence, of polite phrases and carefully measured responses. But in that moment, with her son's anguished gaze and Bridget's weak accusation hanging in the air, she felt her defences crumbling. "I did what was necessary," she said softly, almost inaudibly, though the words carried through the stunned room. "For you, William. For our family." The shock of confession swept across the faces of the guests like a second wave of poison. The truth had been spoken, and there could be no undoing it. The words left Eleanor's lips with a strange mixture of defiance and release, as though confessing aloud unburdened her of a secret she had carried for too long. At first the room remained still, guests frozen in disbelief, their faces pale and tense in the candlelight. William's eyes, wide with anguish, searched hers for some hint of denial, some reassurance that Bridget's accusation was a fevered mistake. But Eleanor did not retract her words. Instead she straightened her back, her voice gaining strength as she continued, "I did what any mother would do when she sees her son about to destroy himself. That girl," she cast a withering glance at Bridget, trembling in William's arms, "would have dragged you and the Piton name into the filth of poverty, superstition and disgrace. I could not stand by while everything we built was thrown away." William recoiled as though struck. His voice shook, thick with grief and fury. "Everything we built? Mother, you mean everything you built for yourself? You tried to murder the woman I love because of where she was born, because of her faith, because you thought she was beneath us." His words cut through the silence, his condemnation raw and unrestrained. Eleanor's eyes flashed with a cold fire. "Beneath us? She is beneath us. You are blind, William. She may carry herself with grace, but she is Irish, a Catholic, a girl who belongs in the servants' quarters, not at your side. Think of the children you would have together. Half-bloods, torn between two worlds, accepted by neither. Better no heirs at all than such an abomination." A murmur of outrage spread through the guests. Even those who had whispered doubts about the marriage recoiled at Eleanor's naked prejudice, her words spoken with venom that left no room for doubt about her intentions. Bridget closed her eyes briefly, a tear slipping down her cheek, while William's face contorted with disbelief. "You speak of blood and legacy, as though they matter more than love, more than human life," he said, his voice breaking. "That girl, as you call her, is my wife, and you, my own mother, have tried to murder her. Do you understand what you have done?" For a fleeting moment, Eleanor's composure cracked. Her lips trembled, her eyes darted as though seeking a sympathetic face in the crowd. But none came. The women who had once deferred to her now looked away in disgust. The men who had respected her influence now stared with thinly veiled contempt, Surrounded by the society she had tried so desperately to preserve, Eleanor realized she stood utterly alone. Yet still she clung to her conviction, whispering as though to herself, "I did it for the family, for William." But in her son's stricken expression, she saw no gratitude, only horror. The moment of confession seemed to drain the air from the room. For several heartbeats no one moved, the only sound Bridget's ragged breathing and William's broken whispers as he tried to comfort her. Then Dr. Harrison, his face grim with the weight of duty, stepped forward. "Mrs. Peaton," he said firmly, "you have admitted to attempted murder in the presence of witnesses. I have no choice but to summon the authorities." Eleanor drew herself up, pearls glinting against the silk of her gown, her expression a mixture of disdain and disbelief. "You would dare!" she hissed, her voice carrying just enough to be heard. "Do you think Boston's constables will lay hands on me? A Peaton, on the word of a half-conscious Irish girl?" But even as she spoke, she could see in the faces around her that her influence had evaporated. Society's approval, once her shield, had crumbled into dust. Servants were dispatched, and within the hour, constables arrived at the mansion, their heavy boots thudding against the polished floors as they entered the reception hall. Eleanor did not resist, though her lips curled in contempt as they informed her she was under arrest. Guests parted in silence as she was escorted past them, her head held high though her wrists were bound. William, still kneeling beside Bridget, did not even glance up as his mother was led away. That indifference cut deeper than any chain. Outside, a crowd had gathered, drawn by rumors that spread with astonishing speed. Word of the bride's collapse during the ceremony had already filtered into the streets, but when whispers turned to accusations of poisoning, the story grew into a sensation. People pressed against the railings, craning for a glimpse of Eleanor as she was placed into the waiting carriage, her proud silhouette framed by torchlight. Some gasped, others jeered, but all recognized that something extraordinary had unfolded within those walls. The scandal was too large to be contained. By nightfall, Boston's newspapers were already setting type for special editions, eager to deliver the tale that would eclipse every other piece of gossip. A Beacon Hill matron accused of poisoning her son's Irish bride at the altar. Back inside the mansion, the celebration had dissolved into sorrow and chaos. The tables groaned with untouched food, the champagne sat flat in half-filled glasses, and the guests departed in uneasy silence, their finery trailing out into the night. William accompanied Bridget to Dr. Harrison's office, where she was treated through the dark hours with a determination that kept death at bay. For Eleanor, however, there would be no reprieve. The scandal she had so desperately sought to prevent had burst into flame, consuming her name and her reputation in a single day. By the time Eleanor Peaton's trial commenced in December of 1852, the city of Boston was ablaze with anticipation. Newspapers across Massachusetts had carried every detail of the poisoning, and the case was spoken of in taverns, parlors, and pulpits alike. To some, it was a grim tale of prejudice and cruelty. To others, a scandalous drama fit for whispers over tea. The courthouse on Court Street overflowed with spectators from the moment the doors opened, a press of curious citizens eager to witness the downfall of one of Beacon Hill's most formidable women. Vendors lined the streets outside, hawking pamphlets that sensationalized the crime with lurid titles, The Poisoned Chalice and The Bride's Betrayal. It was a trial not only of Eleanor Peaton, but of the rigid boundaries that divided Boston's classes, faiths, and families. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Judge Huntington presided with an air of stern gravity, his gavel striking against the bench to command silence from the restless crowd. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Charles Endicott, presented the case as one of cold and deliberate malice. Endicott, a man of sharp words and piercing gaze, laid out the narrative with unflinching clarity. A mother, consumed by pride and prejudice, had poisoned the ceremonial wine in full view of God and society, seeking to murder her son's bride, rather than endure the humiliation of her union. The chalice itself, carefully preserved and tested, was displayed before the jury, its polished surface gleaming under the gas lamps like an accuser in silver. Eleanor sat at the defense table with perfect composure, her dark gown chosen with deliberate modesty, her hair neatly coiled, her expression cool. To many, she looked more like a queen in exile than a woman on trial. Her attorney, Jonathan Reed, attempted to paint her as a grieving widow overwhelmed by fear for her son's future, arguing that her words at the reception were those of hysteria rather than confession. He suggested that Bridget's accusation had been the delirious muttering of a poisoned mind, easily misinterpreted by anxious ears. But the weight of testimony against Eleanor was formidable. Dr. Harrison described the symptoms of arsenic poisoning with clinical precision, and his chemical tests left no doubt as to the presence of poison in the chalice. Witnesses confirmed that Eleanor had handled the vessel moments before the blessing, and Bridget herself, though still frail, prepared to testify. The trial had barely begun, yet already the city sensed its outcome. The spectacle was not only about guilt or innocence, but about the fragility of Boston's old order, exposed under the glare of scandal. Each day, as the court recessed, the crowd spilled into the streets, debating whether Eleanor was a monster or a martyr, but all agreed they were witnessing history. Jonathan Reed, Eleanor's attorney, knew he faced an almost impossible battle, but he approached it with the skill of a man accustomed to weaving doubt where certainty seemed unshakable. In his opening address to the jury, he spoke not of poison and malice, but of a mother's fear. He painted Eleanor as a widow who had borne the heavy burden of raising a son alone, her every decision guided by love and sacrifice. He reminded the jurors of her decades of charitable works, her leadership in civic causes, and the reputation she had carefully maintained. "Is it so unthinkable," he asked, "that a woman who devoted her life to preserving her family's place in this city might speak rash words in the heat of panic, words that have been mistaken for confession?" He leaned heavily on the uncertainty of Bridget's testimony, urging the jury to consider that a young woman in the throes of poison-induced delirium might have seen malice where none existed. Eleanor herself embodied his argument. Each day she arrived in court impeccably dressed, her demeanor calm, her manner respectful toward the judge and jury. She sat with her hands folded, her gaze steady, never weeping or raising her voice. To her supporters, this composure suggested dignity. To her detractors, it was the mask of cold calculation. Reed played upon the jurors' sympathies, calling character witnesses who spoke of Eleanor's generosity, her refinement, and her devotion to William. Ministers testified that she had long supported Boston's charities, and society ladies vouched for her role as a pillar of civic life. The defense suggested that the chalice may have been tampered with by some unknown party, perhaps a servant seeking to stir mischief, or a rival bent on vengeance. But the prosecution dismantled these efforts piece by piece. Dr. Harrison's testimony remained unshaken under cross-examination, his authority as a physician lending weight to every word. He explained with precision how arsenic acts on the human body and how Bridget's symptoms aligned perfectly with that poison. Witnesses recalled seeing Eleanor approach the altar, her hand resting upon the chalice, her movements deliberate. And most damning of all was Bridget herself, pale but resolute, who testified that she had seen Eleanor stir something into the cup before lifting it to her lips. Her words, spoken with quiet conviction, cut through Reed's web of speculation like a blade. By the close of the week, it was clear the defense had begun to falter. The murmurs in the courtroom shifted. What had once been debate about Eleanor's character now turned towards certainty of her guilt. Reed continued to fight valiantly, but each plea seemed weaker than the last, drowned beneath the growing tide of evidence that no jury could ignore. When the prosecution announced that William Peaton himself would take the stand, the courtroom held its breath. Few could imagine the torment of a son called to speak against his own mother, and fewer still could predict how he would choose between love and truth. William walked to the witness box with deliberate steps, his face pale, his posture rigid as though every muscle strained to hold him upright. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore his oath, and seated himself without meeting Eleanor's eyes. She sat motionless at the defense table, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that might have swayed another man, but William did not falter. The district attorney began gently, asking William to describe the events of the wedding day. His voice was steady at first as he recounted the ceremony, the chalice, and Bridget's sudden collapse. But when pressed to speak of his mother's actions, his composure wavered. "I saw her approach the altar," he admitted, his voice low but clear. "She touched the chalice. She lingered over it longer than was necessary. At the time I thought nothing of it. But afterward, when Bridget whispered of the wine, I could not dismiss it." His words fell like stones in the silent chamber. He swallowed hard, then added, "When confronted, my mother did not deny it. She said she had done what was necessary. For me, she claimed, for our name." Reed rose to cross-examine, hoping to draw sympathy from the son. He asked whether William had considered the pressure of gossip, the hysteria of the moment, the possibility that his mother's words had been misheard. But William shook his head, the conflict etched in every line of his face. "I love my mother," he said, and for the first time his voice cracked. "She raised me, guided me, sacrificed for me. But I also love Bridget, and I cannot deny the truth that stands before me. To remain silent would be to betray my wife, and to betray justice itself." He paused, his eyes glistening, and finished with a trembling whisper. "God help me. But my mother tried to kill the woman I love." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Some covered their mouths. Others looked at Eleanor to see how she would react. She did not move, but those nearest to her swore they saw her jaw tighten, her fingers clench ever so slightly against the folds of her gown. For William, leaving the witness box felt like a walk through fire. He had spoken the truth, but in doing so, he had severed the bond between himself and the woman who had shaped his life. The courtroom, already heavy with tension, now seemed to sag beneath the weight of tragedy. The trial had stretched on for nearly 3 weeks, but when the jury withdrew to deliberate, few doubted the outcome. The evidence was too strong, the testimonies too consistent, and the confession too damning to leave much room for mercy. Still, the courtroom remained hushed as the hours dragged on, the gas lamps flickering while spectators whispered anxiously. At last, near nightfall, the jury filed back into their seats, their faces solemn. Judge Huntington called the court to order, and the foreman rose, clearing his throat with deliberate care. "We find the defendant, Eleanor Peaton, guilty of attempted murder in the first degree." The words reverberated through the chamber, met with a collective gasp. Eleanor did not flinch. She sat as though carved from marble, her spine rigid, her face expressionless. Only the faint tightening around her mouth betrayed any reaction. William, seated beside Bridget in the gallery, closed his eyes, the verdict confirming what his heart had already known. Bridget leaned into him weakly, her hand clutching his for strength. Around them, the crowd erupted into murmurs, some voices exultant that justice had prevailed, others hushed with the grim recognition that one of Boston's most respected women had been condemned. Judge Huntington, his voice grave, delivered the sentence. "Eleanor Peaton, you have been found guilty of attempted murder. In recognition of your age, your long-standing contributions to this city, and the plea of your counsel, this court sentences you to 15 years imprisonment at the Massachusetts State Prison at Charlestown." The gavel struck once, echoing like a final toll of doom. For a moment silence followed, then the room exploded with noise, some applauding, some protesting, all caught up in the enormity of what had just occurred. As the constables moved to escort Eleanor from the courtroom, she rose with regal composure, her dark eyes sweeping the room. She did not look at William, nor at Bridget, though both stared at her with a mixture of sorrow and relief. Instead, she lifted her chin and walked forward with measured steps, as though determined that no one would ever see her bend. Outside the courthouse, The crowd surged, shouting her name, some in condemnation, others in pity. Newspaper reporters scribbled furiously, eager to deliver headlines that would sell by the thousands. Society matron, sentenced for poisoning bride. The sentence sent shockwaves through Boston. For the city's elite, it was a sobering reminder that wealth and reputation could not shield one from justice. For the Irish community, it was seen as vindication, proof that their lives could no longer be dismissed as expendable. For William and Bridget, it was a bittersweet relief, their union spared by the truth, though at the cost of a mother's fall. The Piton name, once a pillar of Boston society, now carried a stain that would not easily be washed away. In the months that followed the trial, Boston society remained fixated on the Piton family, their name now inseparable from scandal. Yet while Eleanor's fate was sealed within the walls of Charlestown Prison, William and Bridget began the slow process of piecing their lives together. Their first concern was Bridget's recovery. Though she survived the poisoning, her health remained fragile for weeks. Dr. Harrison visited often, prescribing rest, broths, and careful monitoring. William rarely left her side, keeping vigil through long nights when fevers racked her body or weakness threatened to overtake her. Slowly, strength returned. By spring of 1853, Bridget was able to walk through the public garden again, leaning on William's arm, her steps steady though her frame remained, Ned slender from the ordeal. To those who saw them, she appeared not a victim, but a survivor, her resilience admired even by those who had once doubted her worth. Their marriage, once the subject of ridicule, became instead a story of endurance. Whispers of scandal remained, but now they mingled with a measure of respect. Even some who had condemned the match privately admitted that Bridget had shown remarkable courage, not only in facing Eleanor's malice, but in standing before the court to tell the truth. The O'Sullivan family, once relegated to the margins of Boston society, found themselves viewed with newfound sympathy. Patrick O'Sullivan continued his work at the metalworks, but his daughter's place at William's side elevated their standing in ways no wealth alone could have achieved. William, though scarred by the trial, pressed forward with quiet determination. He took up the management of the Piton business interests, guiding them with the same sense of duty that had once pleased his mother. But his priorities had shifted. He invested time and money into charitable causes, particularly those aimed at helping immigrant families find their footing in Boston. Bridget, too, became deeply involved in parish charities, organizing sewing circles and raising funds for schools that served Irish children. Together they forged a partnership not merely of husband and wife, but of shared purpose. In time, they welcomed children into their home, their family a blending of old Boston respectability and Irish resilience. The very union Eleanor had fought to prevent became a symbol of a city slowly, painfully learning to adapt to change. Yet for William, the joy of his growing family was forever shadowed by the memory of his mother's betrayal. In quiet moments, he admitted to Bridget that he still loved Eleanor, that he wished she had chosen differently. Bridget, with her steady grace, would remind him that love and grief often lived side by side, and that their duty was to build a future stronger than the past that had sought to destroy them. Eleanor Piton entered the Massachusetts State Prison in Charlestown with her head held high, but the weight of years wore her down quickly. Gone were the silks and pearls, replaced by coarse uniforms and the monotony of prison routines. At first, she carried herself with the same imperious dignity that had once silenced drawing rooms, demanding respect from guards and fellow inmates alike. But time eroded her defenses. The long nights, the loss of control, the knowledge that she was forgotten by the very society she had fought to impress, all chipped away at her pride. Letters from William arrived at first, courteous and formal, but they grew infrequent as the years passed. Bridget wrote none at all, her forgiveness limited to silence. Eleanor read each note with trembling fingers, searching between the lines for signs of reconciliation, but what she found instead was distance, a polite duty, rather than love. After 15 years, she was released an old woman, her once dark hair streaked white, her eyes clouded with the weariness of confinement. She returned not to the mansion on Beacon Hill, but to a small rented room in the city's outskirts, supported only by a dwindling allowance and the remnants of the fortune she had once commanded. Few recognized her now, and fewer still cared to remember. On quiet evenings, she would sit by the window, watching the carriages pass, whispering to herself that everything she had done had been for William. Yet no one came to sit with her. No one called her name in friendship or respect. She died alone in 1870, her passing noted in the city's newspapers with little more than a brief notice. Mrs. Eleanor Peaton, widow of the late Jonathan Peaton, aged 71. No mention was made of the trial that had once captivated Boston, though older readers remembered, shaking their heads at the tragedy of it all. She was buried in a modest grave, unmarked by grandeur, her legacy reduced to cautionary whispers. The story of the Poisoned Chalice lingered, however, carried in the memories of those who had witnessed it. For some, it was a tale of prejudice and pride gone mad. For others, a reminder of the fragile line between devotion and destruction. To William and Bridget's children, it was a dark shadow in their family's history, a lesson in the danger of allowing hatred to masquerade as love. And to Boston, it remained a symbol of a city in flux, where old walls crumbled and new bonds were forged in blood and sorrow. Even now, more than a century later, the echo of that day at Trinity Church reminds us that the fiercest enemies are not always strangers, but sometimes those who sit closest, smiling, at our tables. And so ends the tragic tale of the Poisoned Chalice, a story of love defiled by pride and devotion twisted into cruelty. If you found this story haunting, help us keep these forgotten histories alive. Subscribe to the Macabre Record and join us as we uncover more tales where shadows linger in the pages of the past. And let us know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight?